We've been joined by the U.S. Ambassador to Sierra Leone, Bryan Hunt. Ambassador Hunt is here to talk on the Tripartite Committee's report that was presented to President Bill a couple of days ago, and of course, U.S. development in Sierra Leone. And again, the $480 million MCC compact approved for Sierra Leone, among other things. Good morning, Ambassador Hunt. It's a pleasure having you in the studios.
Very good morning. Thank you for having me this morning.
Good morning. I think the most talked about issues, for the past couple of months in Sierra Leone is that of the Tripartite, committee that was set up, and now the report has been presented to the President, and you were part of, you were in that ceremony. What's your stance? What's the U.S. stance and all of these?
Well, I'll say two things to start with. First, I think the Tripartite Committee did an excellent job working with technical experts provided by the United Nations and other donors to come up with very credible recommendations, and with 80 of them, very extensive recommendations as to how to improve the electoral system here in Sierra Leone. Having gone through the report and read the 80 recommendations and the various analyses that the committee came up with, my view is that if those recommendations are implemented, as the committee suggested they should be, then we will see a much better electoral system here in Sierra Leone, an electoral system that is much closer to international best practice, and an electoral system that I believe will deliver better results for the Sierra Leonean people. Now, of course, implementation is going to be the key. A report is only as good as what you do with it. So the committee has made a number of recommendations as to how we should go forward in implementing the report. I know the government is taking those recommendations very seriously, so I hope that we will begin to see decisions from cabinet, legislation introduced in Parliament, regulations introduced in the various election management bodies that speak to what the Tripartite Committee has recommended. And I hope that the government and the APC will continue the dialogue around implementation, and that both parties will be part of that implementation process.
Just as you rightly mentioned, of course, implementation has been the concern of many Sierra Leoneans, because upon its implementation, as you've already put, it will strengthen democracy and, of course, foster unity among all of us Sierra Leoneans. But again, there are still a number of disagreements between the two parties. What's your opinion on the disagreement?
My view is there were always going to be disagreements. Whenever you have a committee that is composed of individuals drawn from different walks of life, from different political philosophies, from different parties, there are going to be issues on which they cannot agree. I prefer to focus on the 80 recommendations on which they could agree, which actually is a monumental achievement. The areas of disagreement, even when you read through some of the split recommendations in the report, it's not that they disagree on what should be done. They disagree on the analysis of the problem, which of course is important, and of course they should keep dialoguing about that. But at the end of the day, on many of the questions as to what should we do about it, the recommendation, when you read it from the APC and from the government teams, are almost identical. So I think, yes, there are disagreements. Yes, they need to keep dialoguing on them. But I think for the people of Sierra Leone, the question to be asking is not so much about differences, but about what will the joint recommendations that both sides have committed to implement do to move the country forward, and how do we take the split recommendations from the teams and combine them into a single recommendation where it makes sense and ensure that that gets added on to the 80.
As it stands, the genesis of the Tripartite Committee is the disagreement of the June 2023 elections conducted. But post the Tripartite report, we've seen unpleasantries from especially the main opposition, who don't seem to be satisfied 100% with the outcome of the Tripartite report. So it brings us to, has the Tripartite Committee resolved the issue it was set up in the first place to resolve, which was the elections disagreement between the APC, the ECSL, and by extension the SLPP?
Yeah. So I think if you look at the Agreement for National Unity and read the terms of reference of the tripartite report, it was actually asked to do three different things. It was asked, one, to examine the 2023 elections and provide its view on those. It was asked to look at any accountability that may stem from the 2023 electoral contest. And it was asked to look at what can be done moving forward to make sure that we never again have a repeat of the 2023 contest in Sierra Leone. My view is that the tripartite addressed all three of those areas. They came to very solid agreement on the third, which for those who are concerned about the future of Sierra Leone may very well be the most important of those three. It made some decisions about what should be done in terms of personnel at the Election Commission. It made some very, I think, good recommendations about external management reviews. It made recommendations about how we appoint commissioners in the future. So I think they did look at some of the key accountability questions. They looked very hard at the 2023 elections. If you read the analysis from both sides in the 540-page report, the reality is that there are fundamental disagreements between the APC and the government on those issues. And unfortunately, I think what the Tripartite Commission found was that the data sets that were available from the ECSL, because of all of the difficulties in the management of the 2023 elections, were insufficient for them to be able to come to a joint conclusion. The SLPP analyzed and felt very strongly that the ECSL announced as declared were accurate. The APC provided a very extensive analysis of where it saw discrepancies, statistical anomalies as they called it, in the ECSL declared results. There are other people who've looked at it as well. We have the National Elections Watch parallel vote tabulation in their report. They came to yet a third conclusion. So I think it really does speak to the difficulties, given all of the irregularities that everyone admits happened in 2023, to really be able to draw a solid recommendation. So I don't think we can blame the members of the committee that they couldn't do what so many others before them have tried to do in making a definitive judgment on the data, because when your data set is faulty or incomplete or just not available, it's always going to be very hard to make those recommendations. What I think they have done, though, and again, for the future of Sierra Leone, I think the most important thing is that they have been able to chart out how to make sure that we never again run into a problem where we have this data set that does not exist or is so incomplete that we cannot make a real judgment on it.
Before elections, pre-elections, when we see violent issues spark here and there, the message to the electorate always is keep calm, express your dissatisfaction or approval at the ballot boxes. But we've come to a point where we see the ballot boxes being in terms of the results announced. This is not a today or June 2023 problem. Even the current president, 2012, had issues with the elections result he challenged in court. So it shows us a pattern of distrust by the politician in the elections results. And one key institution that stands in the middle of this is the Electoral Commission. The recommendations put forward, well, of course, it's a 500-pager or so, and it's so new. A lot of people have not been able to browse through, but I'm sure that you're familiar with some of the points in it. How would that report, the recommendations, define Sierra Leone, A, if we implement them fully, and B, if we do the usual where we have the beautiful like TRC and we do not implement? If we implement, what's the outcome for Sierra Leone? And if we don't, what would be the outcome, the fate of Sierra Leone?
So I'll be very frank. I think your analysis is spot on. The problem did not arise in June 2023. It dates all the way back to 2007. There have been successive attempts to address the problem that didn't really address the problem. I am of the firm view that this time around we have to address the problem. Sierra Leoneans are in a position where if they implement what this report says, if they implement the 80 recommendations, it will fundamentally change how the ECSL functions. The report changes the selection of the ECSL commissioner process to make the nominations come through a civil society panel rather than allowing people to simply select whoever they want to serve on that commission. It creates new professional qualifications for commissioners. It puts in place new safeguards, hiring of staff, and ensures that that process is more transparent and geographically representative of the country. It puts in place new requirements for the ECSL to operate in a transparent fashion. The problem the committee found was that the ECSL was classifying documents or not releasing documents, so no one really knew what the ECSL was doing. It creates a new parliamentary oversight committee. It makes very clear that operational matters should be handled by professional staff. Commissioners are there not to do the day-to-day operations, but to set policy, which is, I think, a fundamental change in how it will operate. And then it requires a full external management review of the ECSL that would actually go in and look at staffing and make sure it's fit to purpose, make sure the people who have the positions are qualified to hold them. So I think all of this taken together, plus the other 80 recommendations, very extensive, would transform the electoral system and really make the election management bodies, the ECSL, the Political Parties Registration Commission, all of the security bodies, much more accountable, much more transparent, much more responsive to the public, and take away some of the questioning that has perpetually followed elections. People here need credibility, and I think this report, if implemented, would give it to them. If they fail to implement the report, then we're in the same place we've been for the last, well, since 2007. And that is not a good place for Sierra Leone's future, because it will simply take us back every 5 years to these crises where the two sides cannot agree on who won. One side supporters believe one thing, the other side supporters believe a different thing, and we're into the hyper-partisan environment that we found ourselves in after 2023. So I really think this is the time to implement, and this is the time to implement jointly. Both sides need to be part of the implementation process.
Ambassador Hunt will soon talk on the MCC among other investments of the U.S. in Sierra Leone. But again, let's look at law enforcement in this report.
Of course.
It is more likely that the report fails to adequately capture law enforcement issues. Of course, recommendation starts. It talks about the police, the manner at which the police during election period. But of course, we've not seen a section that looks at how laws are effectively enforced, breaches and penalties for such breach, Ambassador.
So I think there are some areas that speak to that. There is a new recommendation in there that deals with campaign finance, violation of campaign finance laws, violation for use of state resources, that will now carry up to the penalty, if implemented, would carry up to the penalty of disqualification of a candidate from being able to seek office, which is a tremendously increased penalty over what you currently have, and I think would help to address some of the very fundamental issues with people misusing state resources during elections or violating the campaign finance regulations. It also speaks to the whole question of oversight, transparency, and accountability of all of the law enforcement entities involved in elections, and again provides a number of recommendations, as it does for the Election Commission, as to how to ensure their operations are much more transparent. It also spends a lot of time talking about the Independent Police Complaints Board and the need to regularize that, give it legal standing, ensure that it's able to fully carry out its function to make sure that citizens who do feel that they have not been treated fairly by the police have a place to go for redress. So I think it gives some very solid recommendations. Clearly, the reform of the entirety of the justice and law enforcement sector was well outside the scope of what the committee could look at. But I think in terms of the electoral piece of that, which is what they were asked to examine, they did a fairly good job of giving us recommendations that will make the electoral piece of that better. We all agree there needs to be comprehensive justice reform here in Sierra Leone. That's something that the government and the opposition have talked about extensively. I hope that they will move forward with that as well. But I don't think we can expect an election report to fundamentally address some of the much more ingrained issues that are generalized across large areas of society.
You forced to come with a statement with regards to the Tripartite Committee. Many have commended that moves, you know, in terms of what we saw on X. But again, others kept criticizing, you know, even the report that was issued by the US, tweet that was made by the US, saying that the international partners know the problem of Sierra Leone, and they seem very hypocritical to, of course, make it very open to the president also as to what should be done in terms of the process itself. What's your submission to say?
Well, first, this report is a Sierra Leonean report. It didn't come from the international community. As I've said many times, the solutions for Sierra Leone's election problems have to come from Sierra Leoneans. And this report very much comes from Sierra Leoneans, which is why we back strongly the recommendations that they've made. It's not a question of the international community saying to the government and the opposition, you need to do this. These are Sierra Leoneans. These are members of the government and the opposition who are telling their own leadership, it's time to move. It's time to move in this direction. This is what we need to do as Sierra Leoneans to address it. So this is very much a Sierra Leonean solution to a Sierra Leonean problem. The job of the international community was to provide technical support, which we did. And from our perspective, it's also to help press for implementation of this now that the committee has finished its work. Both sides have said repeatedly they intend to implement. Both sides have said repeatedly they intend to carry these things forward. So I think it's important for all of us who are friends and who care very deeply about Sierra Leone that our voices are heard and echo those of others who are calling for this.
Voters' apathy, quickly Fabian, voters' apathy and that of participation, I know, are always a concern to the international partners. Mm-hmm. How well does it capture the issue of disinterest from the voters and even the low turnout in these elections?
Yeah, so it actually speaks quite eloquently about the need for the ECSL to do a better job at civic education and voter turnout. There's a number of recommendations about the ECSL needing to be much more proactive in driving that process, in working much closer with civil society organizations, in making sure that they have the resources necessary to help educate the voters of Sierra Leone and encourage them to go to the polls. So again, I think that the recommendations that the committee came up with are spot on. It's a question of implementation, and I hope that the Commission takes that recommendation very seriously and drives it forward.
Ambassador, Sierra Leoneans in excitement, the MCC, we finally were looking forward to, we got that. Are you familiar with the timelines and how much longer it's going to take for Sierra Leone to receive the money, especially when the agreement is that Sierra Leone would be investing in the energy sector?
Yeah. So let me say a couple of things. First, the way the MCC process works is that the money will ultimately be made available for projects here in Sierra Leone. We don't write a check and hand it over to the Sierra Leonean government. There'll be a joint implementation unit that's set up that makes the contracting decisions, awards the contracts for the work that needs to be, that's been agreed to be done under the compact, oversees that. The checks go to the contractors who are carrying out the work. So I think that's an important distinction to make. But in terms of timelines, the board has approved the compact. The board now has to notify our Congress of their intent to sign the compact. And Congress has a period of time under which it needs to say yes or no and raise more questions. So we're just at the start of that process. Now that process normally goes relatively quickly. In some cases, Congress has more questions, and I can't predict what Congress will ask or want information on. They have signaled that they wanted very much to see the final report. They've signaled they want to see progress on implementation of the final report of the Election Commission before Congress will say yes to the signature. So we are in the process of notifying them, and we'll see how long Congress decides it wants to take to deliberate over this and ultimately give permission. My hope is that we can close this out certainly as quickly as possible, because I do think Sierra Leone needs the resources, but at the same time, I do think it's important that we have some balance here and we make sure that that report isn't just put on a shelf. So we're going to be looking very carefully to see what happens over the next few weeks in terms of decisions on implementation. Once the compact is signed, there is what they call a pre-implementation period. The government, as you will see when the compact is signed, has agreed to do a number of things that we will help them with that lay the groundwork for the project to be successful. Things like the reform of EDSA, which is going to be absolutely critical for anything in the energy space. There's a number of other things that have to be done in terms of environmental impact studies and other things before we can get to the contracting. Normally, that process, depending on how extensive it is and how quickly the government moves, can take between 6 months and a year before the ground is actually broken on the work. That can be accelerated some, depending on how quickly things can be done and the preconditions can be met, but that's the normal time frame. And then, of course, MCC is a 5-year implementation. So from the point where we begin implementation, there's a 5-year period in which all work needs to be completed. Now, as you know, when you're dealing with large construction projects, those first few years, you don't see quite as much as in the last few years, simply because of how construction works. You have to do the architectural designs, you have to do a lot of the preparation of the ground, so it does take more time before you see the big works coming online. But I would say you're probably looking at having it entirely done within about a 6-year time frame, but you should begin to see some parts of it completed much sooner than that, some as early as year 2 or year 3 of the implementation.
For quick clarification, so we probably may not misquote or misinterpret what you said. You said to observe that the report, the recommendations are not put on a shelf. Does this mean the actions of the MCC going forward on when we start getting access to the money depend on the actions the government would be taking in regards to the recommendations put forward by the Tripartite Committee?
That is certainly what our Congress has signaled to us in preliminary consultations, is that they want to see progress towards implementation of the report. Now, they've not defined what that progress looks like. I wouldn't want to put words in the mouth of my congressional colleagues, since they're an independent branch of government. But they have signaled that they will want to see implementation of the report going forward.
All right. To the report itself now, the MCC itself, that
yes.
We're looking forward to still as a country with excitement. Oftentimes, what the government deals with is they would get grants and funds and money from international community, but then you would find that the sector they were supposed to implement that money, much change or impact is not tangible, and they still find themselves in sort of a disagreement or stalemate with the public, who would now say, but they had received money for XYZ reason, and some of the things we get sometimes as an excuse or justification for why the situation is the conditionalities that come with these grants, where they would say that the international donors now would want to stipulate how the money is spent, and oftentimes much of it goes back to the contractors that they select. How much of a free will would the government have in implementing the money that MCC would be giving, especially when it's clear it's for energy?
Yeah.
But how much free will would they have to the execution of that resource for the energy sector?
Quite a bit. The way that it is set up, the way MCC operates is different from most other development programs. They will set up here in Sierra Leone what's called the Millennium Challenge account, which will be a local entity that has a board comprising both U.S. and Sierra Leonean representatives, and that entity will direct the implementation. So the government will have its members on the board, MCC will have its members on the board. It's an even number, and they jointly will make decisions about the contracting, about the implementation of the project. So the way that we look at it in terms of contractor selection for MCC is that all of that money should be spent locally. This is not consultancies, this is not people coming in to give advice. That's not what the MCC does. What the MCC does is tangible, on-the-ground construction of infrastructure. That's its comparative advantage. So what you should see is $480 million going to building your energy distribution and transportation network.
Ambassador Hunt, if I am right, the actualization of the MCC money is contingent on the implementation of the recommendations in the Tripartite report. But again, the Tripartite is a baby of the unity agreement, and over time we've seen the implementation of the resolutions in that agreement. Are you of the firm conviction that yes, indeed, Sierra Leoneans, perhaps the government, will heed to these recommendations and see the implementation of same?
So I obviously do not have a crystal ball, or at least I didn't consult it this morning before coming in. What I would say is that the U.S. government takes what the Sierra Leonean parties tell us at their word until it is shown otherwise. So we have been told by both the government and the APC that they intend to fully implement this report. Until I see that they're not doing that, I will be more than happy to believe that they will do so, and I will continue to work with them to encourage them to do so, provide them the technical support to do so. If at some point we see that the implementation is not happening, then we'll be having a very different conversation. But the way that the MCC is structured, we have to have congressional approval for the signature. Congress has signaled they want to see implementation. Congress did not say they needed to see every recommendation implemented or this percentage or that percentage. What Congress is going to look at is to ensure, when it's asked to approve the signature, that there is progress being made, and sufficient progress so that they can have confidence that the key issues that evolved in 2023 are not going to repeat themselves. We're very concerned, frankly, about making a 6-year commitment to Sierra Leone, having an election coming up in 2028, which would be about midway through that 6-year commitment, and then having a repeat of 2023 and having to say, well, this country's no longer on a democratic trajectory. We have to pause everything. That's a waste of everyone's time and resources. So we want to make sure that when we begin, we're very confident. Obviously, we can't predict everything, but we're very confident that the country will continue on a solid democratic trajectory, which is what the law requires for MCC to implement.
Before the approval of the MCC, there is the gas plant projects by the U.S. Many Sierra Leoneans are misunderstanding the two as we speak, taking into account the bidding process for the former, the gas plants project. Many are thinking it's the dues of the MCC that is currently dripping on the gas plants project. So how will you delink the two?
Yeah, so they're two completely separate things, two completely different U.S. government agencies that are involved, different sets of U.S. government funds. They do not overlap. The 480 is spent by the Millennium Challenge Corporation on the distribution and transportation network of energy per the compact. The $410 million is from the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, and that is going to the private sector that is developing the gas project. So that is not a government project. That's entirely private sector driven. What the Development Finance Corporation has done is essentially serve as the bank to the private sector to finance and to provide investment insurance guarantees for that project. So it's different money, different purpose, different entity that's receiving the money, but it will have also a tremendous impact on the generation of power here in Sierra Leone, which, as we all know, is a very serious problem right now.
Ambassador, we've had a couple of messages on our Facebook page, and it's time we go through some of them. We can't go through all of them. First from my end is from Kaifala Kosia, who says, internal issues as Sierra Leoneans have been addressed by the U.S. ambassador. That's his question.
Mosdi says, my question for you, Mr. Ambassador, there's a popular view by most, if not all, Sierra Leoneans that this government, okay, I'm going to skip that question. Shaka Brahima says, how can the MCC compact be tied to that agreement?
Abbas Abib Kokabangali says, why America government is playing with people's lives in Sierra Leone? This idea of holding the MCC grants because of political instability, which we all know political instability is not possible in Africa politics, because after elections, for example, the election observers may not understand some processes in Sierra Leone electoral systems. They will do the observation, leave our country by saying that the elections were not transparent in the report. These are the type of reports that has created problems for the losing parties not to accept election results. To me, it's obvious that, okay, this one is not also clear.
Okay, Mosdi's question here, he says, my question for you, Mr. Ambassador, there's a popular view by most, if not all, Sierra Leoneans that this government is not recognized by the international community because of the problems in the past elections. Now that we have gone through this tripartite process, can you here and now tell us whether the United States is officially recognizing the government of President Bio? Thank you.
Yeah, continue if you have another. Let me keep watching that.
Okay, I think for time we'll just have to limit the messages to those. Ambassador, your response?
So on the first question, the questions of democracy and human rights are questions that are very important domestic ones. They are also very important international ones. Sierra Leone has made certain commitments under the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, as well as the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Some of those commitments relate directly to the holding of free and fair periodic elections. So the international community does have a very strong interest in what happens on those matters, and that's very much why myself and other international ambassadors and the UN and Universal Periodic Reviews talk about those issues in Sierra Leone. It's not to criticize, it's not to judge, it's to try to encourage the government and the rest of society to live up to the obligations that this country has made under international agreements. On the MCC, I would challenge the idea that there cannot be stability in Africa. There are many African countries that are at least as stable as the United States. I would argue some are perhaps even more stable at times. South Africa, for example, just went through a very historic election process where the ANC lost the majority for the first time, and that government is forming. It is looking very much like any transition of power in Europe or the United States. So you can absolutely have stability on the African continent. And South Africa is but one example. Botswana's had stability for a long time. Namibia's had stability for a long time under democratic systems. Ghana, even Senegal just went through, yes, they had some challenges during their election, but they've made a very stable transition of power. So I think it's very fair to anticipate that Sierra Leone can do the same. And under the terms of the MCC, one of the laws that our Congress has passed is that in order for the MCC to provide funding to a country, it has to be moving on a sustained democratic trajectory. Sierra Leone obviously has had its election problems in 2023. We took a pause. We gave Sierra Leoneans the opportunity to work through that. I think the Agreement for National Unity, the Tripartite Commission final report show that Sierra Leoneans are serious about doing that. And frankly, I'm reasonably confident that they will continue to move towards implementation. But yes, there are conditions that are imposed by our Congress on the MCC. So the MCC has to take these issues into account when it's evaluating whether or not to move forward with a compact, not just in Sierra Leone, but anywhere around the globe. It's just fundamental to how they have to do their business by law.
On the recognition of
yes,
U.S.
Thank you. On the recognition of U.S.
U.S. government recognizing President Biya's government.
Yes. So the United States is not in the business of recognizing foreign governments. Our diplomatic relations are with a country. We recognize countries, and we've recognized Sierra Leone since your independence. And that is irrespective of transitions of power. We allow countries to determine how those transitions of power are going to be carried out. In Sierra Leone's case, President Biya was declared, he was inaugurated, we work with his government. When Sierra Leone holds its next election, we will work with whichever government results from that. We don't get into the business as the United States of recognizing governments around the world. And you can understand why that is and how complicated that would be and how much that would get into international politics, particularly when you have things like coup d'etats in a place like Guinea or Niger or Mali, where a government leaves by less than constitutional means and a new government is installed by extra constitutional means. So we stay away from that whole question and focus on recognizing states and working with whichever government is in power.
Including military governments?
We do, in fact, work with military governments. We have restrictions as to what we can do, but our diplomatic relations with Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, Guinea have continued, despite the extra constitutional transitions of government. Now, there are many things we do not do with those countries. We, by law, cannot provide certain forms of foreign assistance. We, by law, cannot provide certain forms of security assistance. And there are other things that we choose not to do with them because they are military regimes. But we continue to recognize those countries, and we continue to deal with the governments that are in power in those countries.
Ambassador, what sort of further opportunities does the approval of the MCC open up Sierra Leone to, say particularly to the U.S. government?
What we have found is when MCC chooses to invest in a country, private sector investors follow. The MCC globally is seen as, let's call it a seal of approval. Private investors look, they say, great, the MCC believes that country is on the right political, economic, social trajectory for stability, for investment in its people, for moving towards democracy. Therefore, it is a safer place for us as a private sector entity to come and invest. So in addition to the $480 million in funding, we believe it will unlock a host of new private sector entities that look at Sierra Leone to do business. And when that happens, our organizations like the Development Finance Corporation, Trade and Development Agency, Export-Import Bank of the United States will be there to support that follow-on private sector investment.
The reason for that question is Sierra Leone a stable place to invest at the moment for the U.S.?
Certainly there are U.S. investors here in Sierra Leone. I was with many of them last night at our Independence Day celebration, and many of those investors are doing quite well. The question, I think U.S. investors as a whole are very cautious in Africa. Our companies are not the risk takers that some of our European counterparts companies are. So they tend to be relatively conservative when they are looking at investments. They tend to look very closely at not just questions of economic return, but questions of the overall operating environment, the judiciary, questions of political stability. Each company is going to assess it slightly differently. When I give advice to companies, I don't try to make absolute statements about it is or is not. I think my approach is to give them the information, such as we see it. And when I'm talking about Sierra Leone right now to U.S. companies, I talk about it as a potential opportunity for investment, because we do have companies that are making excellent rates of return on their investments here. I talk about the fact that the political situation is improving. I think the Agreement for National Unity has moved us tremendously forward from where we were when it was signed in October. When we talk about the investment climate, we talk about, yes, there are certain areas of problems, but there are also things that the government is doing right. There are also things that are moving in the right direction. The decision to sign on to the arbitral conventions that give external arbitration as an option to resolve business disputes was a monumental change, which has really opened up the possibility for private sector investors who wouldn't have otherwise considered Sierra Leone. So I think you have to be honest with investors. You don't want to paint a picture that everything is perfect. I think we all know that there are areas that we could still see improvement in, but you also don't want to paint an untrue picture of Sierra Leone as just being so problematic you couldn't even consider investment there. I think Sierra Leone, like most countries, is somewhere well between those two and probably closer to the positive right now, and certainly moving in the positive direction.
Ambassador Hunt, we appreciate having you in the program. We'll have wished to overrun the program, taking into account the number of issues, a number of things that are there to talk about. But nonetheless, we appreciate your coming in our studios this morning.
Of course.
Thank you.
My pleasure.